So in doing research involving over 20,000 people in preparation for writing The Great Sex Rescue, I would imagine today you would be someone who is fairly unshockable because of everything that you've heard. But like, what's the last time you remember hearing feedback or stories from somebody that was like, I wasn't expecting to hear that?
Yeah, because everything going through my head is like, wow, you need to call the police on that. Like, that's not normal.
Welcome to What We Really Want, conversations about connection. Settle in and get ready for a great conversation. Let's talk about what we really want.
I have a question.
Okay.
How is it February already?
And warm. I'm not ready for
70 degrees?
Warm. I'm kind of over the like Arctic cold, but I'm not ready for warm. Actually, it feels good out right now.
We've had us a week as we sit here recording on a Friday. We have been in Nashville.
Yep. The last one.
Flown the coop. Yep. We've moved our youngest to Nashville. You've heard us talk about Ladybird Taco quite a bit here on the show. We've got a lot of friends who are connected to Ladybird who have been guests and who are going to be guests in the future. And Claire has worked for the store here in Alabama for a couple of years, and she's moving on up.
Moving on up. It's crazy.
So we're really excited for this opportunity for her, but you were just saying earlier today, it's a little weird.
Yeah.
Driving by where she lived here.
Apartment. It's close to our house, and I drive by her little street all the time, and it's weird. Just running errands. I would call her and see if she could go with me, and now I can't do that. So it's kind of sad.
It is sad. It's one of those times I was actually thinking about multiple emotions to be present at the same time, because I was really happy and excited for her and sad for us, and a little sad for her, probably feeling a little scared and this new thing. But man, she's just killing it. So it's been a heck of a week. We're both kind of tired, but excited. We're also really excited for you to hear this conversation coming up with Sheila Wray Gregoire and Keith Gregoire. This is episode 30. Called First Do No Harm. You know why I called it that?
No.
Because I'm clever.
What made you think?
Well, because two reasons. One is Keith is a doctor, and for a long time I thought that first do no harm was a quote from the Hippocratic Oath, which, doctors have historically given when they become doctors. Actually, it's not in the Hippocratic Oath, but it's a principle of doctors that in the treatment of patients, first priority needs to be not to do anything that would harm the patient. But the other reason was just because that's been such a focus of Sheila's writing and blogging, because she is probably best known in the last decade for calling out messages in evangelicalism that she believes now are very harmful, maybe well-intentioned, but harmful when it comes to messages about marriage and sexuality.
Yeah, they don't have the motive to hurt people. But I was also thinking, like, what we don't know, so a lot of what they promoted is maybe what they were taught.
You mean just like the principle of we don't know what we don't know?
Yeah. So I just think about all the messages that are very similar, that are not helpful, that are harmful. Like, those are good people, love God. And so, like, how do those messages get communicated? Where did they come up with those things?
For me, what it does is it reminds me of what an important responsibility it is for people who are proclaiming this is what the Bible teaches, to make sure that we're speaking accurately, right? Because we can say this is what the Bible says, but oftentimes we say this is what that means, and we're running it through a filter of just what we were taught, what we've have passed down through culture. And, you look at Christians in America versus other parts of the world, and then you look at Christians in certain parts of America compared to other parts of America, and the traditions are different. And so if you've got a whole lot of people who love Jesus who have such different opinions about what the Bible's saying, it really does call for some scrutiny. And not to say that, change everything that anybody's ever said, but be willing to say, well, is this what the Bible's really teaching?
Right.
And I think that's what Sheila and Keith and Sheila's co-authors in The Great Sex Rescue are saying we've got to start doing more faithfully, because some of the messages that have just been widely accepted have been very, very hurtful.
One thing that we talk about on this podcast, Sheila I think, brought it up about depriving one another or not depriving one another. I don't think I ever thought of it. And I'm not saying how I was taught it, but what I thought was it's all about me not depriving you. And it's like, that's not what it says. And that's not what it's about. And so I think that might have been one of the things I was encouraged by the most.
And talking about and kind of defining sex as a sexual experience that's equitable and mutually pleasurable. And gosh, it's so sad how rarely that's the case, that it's equitable, meaning it's the way that both partners are agreeing. And it's also making sure that there's not this almost 50-point orgasm gap between men and women. There's a lot of things that just sadly people just haven't thought enough about. And so people like Sheila and Keith are disruptors, right? They're irritants. They're flies in the ointment in the best kind of ways to get people talking. And you'll see what we mean as you listen to this.
Well, you probably got an idea just by the intro. People's toes might already be curling.
And that's okay.
That's okay.
Don't forget, if you haven't followed or subscribed to the podcast yet, we sure would love for you to do that. We would love for you to give us a 5-star rating and write a positive review. Those are also super helpful. But for now, we hope that you enjoy episode 30, First Do No Harm, with Sheila Wray Gregoire and Keith Gregoire, coming up right now. Welcome, Sheila Wray Gregoire and Keith Gregoire. We're so glad to have both of you on the podcast today.
Thanks. It's good to be here.
Yeah, thanks for inviting us.
So Stacey and I are a couple who has benefited from reading The Great Sex Rescue and following you guys. And so we've been really looking forward to this conversation. And as we start all the episodes, we want to do the same with you and just ask both of you guys, what do you really want out of the conversation we're about to have?
Can I start?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, this is going to sound really nerdy, but I believe there's a lot of hope in numbers. I believe there's a lot of hope in data, and we've done the largest research projects in just sexual and marital health and evangelicalism, and I love sharing numbers. So I hope that's going to give people hope that there is hope. That's a lot of hope. That's
my gosh, I'm so excited because I love numbers too. Love the data. Keith, how about you?
Yeah, well, that's the problem when the other person goes first is they say exactly what you were going to say. The way I would phrase it though is I'm a doctor. That's my main job, and so we always practice based on evidence. There's actually something called evidence-based medicine, and so we just really want to bring evidence of things that can help. A lot of the stuff that you've been talking about on your podcast is evidence-based, and we just want to give people that's hope. Don't be afraid of learning. Don't be afraid of investigating what actually does work to solve these kind of problems.
I love that you just said that, because I feel like in my experience and the experience of a lot of people I've talked to, I think there's a fear that if I really know what's going on, that I'm going to discover something bad. So I'm almost afraid of the evidence or afraid of the facts, because as long as I don't really know what's going on, I can kind of keep my head in the sand. But you're saying that the more we find out, the more we explore the evidence underneath the struggles, that's actually what leads us to hope.
I mean, Jesus said he's the way, the truth, the life, right? So we don't need to be afraid of truth. And I think when we learn to walk in the way of Jesus, we're going to see good fruit in our lives.
Love it. Well, before we hop into some of the topics that we've been getting ready for, I know that Stacey and I would love to just get to know you guys a little bit. And so tell us a little bit about where you're both from, where you live, your family, your work. I mean, Keith, you've already hinted at the fact that you're a physician, but just tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, so we live in southeastern Ontario. So we're on the northeastern side of the Great Lakes, on the very edge, if anyone's looking at a map.
You got to say A, though, to Canada A.
Yeah, we like to go out and about in the south. How's it going, Yeah, and we've been married. I don't even know how long we've been married. How long is it?
It will be 33 years in December.
Okay, 33 years.
Oh, we're 33 in January, and I can never remember either. I just happened to be thinking about that recently, so...
Well, it's like once you get over 30, so I don't even know. Like I remember, I know there's 35 coming up at some point.
Yeah,
you remember the big ones, yeah.
Yeah, we have two adult daughters. The oldest one works with us. She's one of the co-authors on The Great Sex Rescue, and she deserves better. And we have 3 grandkids, which are it's just so much fun.
We have one.
How old are your grandkids?
Almost 5, almost 3, and under a year. Yeah.
Yeah. 8 months,
that's awesome.
Yeah. We just have one so far.
Almost 3.
He's almost 3 at the time we're recording this.
Yeah.
So. Okay. So this isn't the only thing that I want us to talk about today, but I do want to spend some time talking about what you, Sheila, are probably best known for, which is the book that you wrote with Rebecca, your daughter, and then with Joanna Sawatsky, The Great Sex Rescue. Mm-hmm. So that came out in 2021. And I know that in chapter 1, you do a really great, clear job giving the backstory about why you wrote the book. But rather than me reading from it, I just would love to hear you talk about it for a minute. Like, where did the desire to write this book come from?
Well, I have been blogging about sex and marriage since 2008. I started out as a mommy blogger and, housework, organizing, parenting. Keith was working as a physician. I was doing a lot of speaking at women's events. And so I just started blogging to try to build my platform. And the more I talked about sex, the more my traffic grew. And so I kind of became this Christian sex lady without ever meaning to. I do have 2 graduate degrees. I have a research degree in sociology. So, this was kind of my shtick, but no one ever thinks, hey, I'm going to grow up and be the Christian sex lady. And so I wrote a bunch of books about sex that did quite well in the 2010s. And then everything changed for me in January of 2019. I had a migraine. It was a Friday afternoon. I didn't want to work. And I was on Twitter and people were fighting about whether they needed love or respect. And they were referring to Emerson Eggerich's book, Love and Respect, which says that men's primary need is respect and women's is love. And I thought, yeah, I need respect too. So maybe I'll just go read that because that is an awesome way to procrastinate. So I went and got the book, and being the sex person that I am, I turned to the sex chapter, which is only about 12 pages. And it's in the advice section for women. So it's addressed to women, all about how much men need sex. And I swear it was like a nuclear bomb went off in my living room. Because up until that moment, I really hadn't read a lot of other evangelical sex and marriage books. We even spoke at marriage conferences and I would hold it up and recommend it because it was best selling. Because I just figured they love Jesus, I love Jesus. We're all saying the same thing. And that day I realized, oh no, we are not. We are so not saying the same thing. And we tried to raise the alarm. We wrote a week-long set of posts on how harmful the book is about sex, but then broadly more harmful. And we tried to get focused on the family that publishes it to pay attention, and they didn't. And so Joanna Sawatsky, who was working for me at the time, is a statistician, epidemiologist. And she said, well, why don't we just do a study and see how messages like those in these books have affected people? And so that's what we did. So the Great Sex Rescue, we surveyed 20,000 women to try to find out 20,000. Yeah, it was huge. Biggest study that's been done so far. And we've done several others since, but that was the start. Looking at how messages really common in evangelicalism, which ones actually detract from marital and sexual satisfaction and make things worse. Because that should not be of Jesus. That should not be.
We'll be right back.
How have things gotten so out of control? How did something that didn't seem like such a big deal at first completely take over? Porn and sex addiction are destroying your life and killing your relationships. You know you can't keep going on like this, keeping secrets and telling lies. Something has to change. But how? Most men who struggle with unwanted or addictive sexual behavior have tried to fix it on their own. But sex addiction is powerful and complicated. Recovery is possible, but it isn't easy. It requires us to focus on more than just behavior. It requires us to look at our whole lives and the parts of our stories that contribute to addiction. If you're ready to find freedom, maybe it's time for you to get to the roots. The Roots Retreat is a 4-day therapeutic and spiritual intensive. You'll work with therapists and coaches who specialize in sex addiction and recovery. You'll learn how to take healthy ownership of your behavior. You'll discover how your life experiences set the stage for addiction to develop. You'll see how God factors into your struggle, and you'll learn effective tools for ongoing recovery after the retreat. If you're ready to stop trying what doesn't work, if you're ready to experience real hope, healing, and change, let's get to the roots.
Visit awakenrecovery.com/Roots Retreat or click the Roots Retreat link in show notes.
Yeah.
And I want to say two things. First, the first thing I want to say is to tell you how incredible a researcher Sheila is, because the work she did was phenomenal, right?
Mm-hmm.
As a physician, I'm always reading journal articles and looking at the evidence, and what she did was really high level. Some of her critics have said things like, well, you just surveyed people who believe like you and they told you what you want to hear. And that's complete nonsense. What she actually did was she surveyed people who believed some things and people who believed other things. And then she compared how the two groups did. So if they all agreed with her, she wouldn't have comparison groups. So it's ridiculous.
Yeah.
So
Well, how could you get 20,000 people to agree with you?
Well, yeah, exactly. And most of the people who answered the survey didn't even come from my survey links. So
Well, Keith, you said something about Sheila's critics, and I was wanting to ask about that because, I mean, some of the words that people could use to describe you guys would be, crusaders or disruptors or challengers or dissenters, because you call out by name specific books as having contributed to the sexual harm that many people have experienced.
Yeah.
And I know that you do a really good job when you first say this is what we're going to do, of not questioning the intentions or the motives behind those authors, and to even acknowledge that there are people who have been helped by some of the things where there has also been harm. And so, that's a part that probably is easy for critics to miss, that you did say those things. But when you criticize, often you're going to get criticized, right? And so I'm sure that that's been pretty rampant or pretty prevalent in the responses. I was going to say backlash, and there probably has been some.
It has been a backlash,
but the various responses to the book, what's that been like, and how much of that were you prepared for?
We knew there would be some. It was really hard for the first 2 years. I went through a pretty low period, and the reason was I was actually friends with some of the authors that we ended up critiquing, and we didn't set out to critique people. We did this scientifically. We looked at the 15 best-selling sex and marriage books, and then we analyzed them. And 2 of them didn't meet our criteria because they didn't talk about sex enough. So we had 13. And some of them were written by friends of mine. But we found there was harm. And my thought was, well, if I was doing harm, I would want to know and I would want to change. And in fact, after doing our survey, I begged Zondervan to let me rewrite my best-selling book at the time, The Good Girl's Guide to Great Sex, because I couldn't stand behind it anymore. I knew that I had said some things that didn't line up with what we found. And so, they did let me rewrite it. They didn't pay me to rewrite it, but I completely rewrote the book. And then we also wrote The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex at the same time. But I took books out of print when I thought, I didn't say that right.
So putting your money where your mouth is, really.
Yeah. And I guess it's heartbreaking to me, the shame that we have caused young boys in how we've talked about lust, the pain that we have caused women, literal pain, by increasing hugely rates of sexual pain. There's just the negative dynamics and how we have actually made it more difficult for couples to find intimacy together. Like, that's awful. And I'm heartbroken by what's happened. And I just assumed that if everyone else loved Jesus, they would be too. And that was a hard thing. That was a hard thing to swallow.
Yeah. I recently was talking to somebody who has just found out about her husband's addiction. And she told a family member who she had a pretty good relationship with. It was a male. And the first question was, how is your intimacy, or how has your intimacy been?
Yeah.
And I mean, it just, I have a full body chill going through me. Like, when I think about that's where your head
Probably
goes.
even now.
Oh, right now. Yeah, I did when she told me, and I'm like, oh my gosh. Like, it's, but I mean, I understand, because of the way I was raised, I understand where they're coming from, but they're wrong. So it's sad that even now, like, that is just so prevalent in the way people think.
This work is not just for the benefit of women, but it's for men as well. And the grief that you experience of these young Christian boys growing up to feel shame about normal things that God created in them. And people reading your book, and you talk about sexual inequity, you talk about the orgasm gap between women and men. And it could be very easy, if you're just taking a flyover cursory look at the point you're trying to make, to just assume you're lumping in with all the men are the problem, women are always the victims. But it sounds like you're saying women and men have both been victimized, if that's not too strong a word, by some of the cultural messages about sex within Christianity.
Absolutely. Well, okay. Do you mind if I go off for a bit here, Keith?
Absolutely. I have something to say too, but I'll let you go first.
Okay. So the book, Every Man's Battle, and that book series has sold 4 million copies.
Mm-hmm.
It literally says, and this is a quote, men just don't naturally have that Christian view of sex. And it says, when we're talking about sexual sin, we got there naturally simply by being male. There's even a chapter title that says, just by being male.
Mm.
So
I remember.
what they're saying is that God created men to sin. And when you are 13, 14 years old and you're starting to have sexual feelings and you're getting erections by looking at a trash can, like no matter what you look at, you get erections. Like, they're just happening.
I remember.
And you feel like you don't know what's wrong with you. And then you hear all this messaging about lust. And you assume that if you see a woman or a girl who's starting to develop and has a chest and you're attracted to her, that you have now sinned, how are you going to feel about God?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to feel like God created me to sin and then told me that I'm not allowed to.
Mm-hmm.
So he put me in this absolutely impossible position. And the amount of shame that causes, we actually measured it. So our follow-up book to The Great Sex Rescue was The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex. So we did a survey of men, asking men basically the same questions that we asked women. So we did a very similar survey. But we did drill down a lot on this idea of lust. So we asked men, hey, do you have a daily struggle with lust? And 75% of men said yes. Okay, so that's a lot of men, but it's not every man. It's not every man. Let's just start off with. But then we gave men a bunch of different scenarios where they might lust in a course of a day. Okay, and we took these scenarios from our bestsellers because they all had these scenarios in them. So we gave the scenarios that are in our books, and then we gave several options of what a man could do in each of these scenarios. And the options would span from, not even noticing what was going on to, actively lusting afterwards and remembering things. And what we found is that of those 75% who said they have a daily struggle with lust, about half of them do not show any signs of lust in any scenario we gave them, and they don't struggle with porn.
Mm-hmm.
So our question is, why do they think they're lusting?
Mm-hmm.
Because they've been told to see and to notice is to lust, right?
Exactly. They've been told that noticing is lusting. And so they think they're going through their entire lives and God's angry at them.
See, I love that. Sam Jolman talks about that very research that you're talking about in his book, The Sex Talk You Never Got. And I think it's so important just to do that foundational work of saying, men, you have been told a lie. Noticing is not lusting. There's so many different phases that you can go through, but sometimes it feels like it's so instantaneous, right? But that's often in many men's lives a conditioned response. And the gap between noticing and lusting can get much shorter over time, of course, if we're nurturing that, but it's not an automatic. And it's so important for them to hear that.
I have a question. And then
Keith, I know you wanted to speak to it as well.
Real quick, I'm just being aware of something that I was talking to women in our group about. They were not being able to grasp lusting. They're like, I don't lust. I don't understand. And so I just kind of thought of like, I know a lot of them watch, any number of movies, and there may be a male actor who they just drool over. And I said, notice, I think I was clear about noticing that they're handsome or cute or whatever, eye candy, whatever you call them, is not necessarily bad. I mean, they're cute. Okay, let's acknowledge that. But then when you start like wishing your husband was acted like them, like Hallmark movies for crying out loud, they're just not real. Who acts like all those things? And so when you start doing that, that's kind of where you get into the realm of you're imagining your own husband being like that. And that's not even really sexual, but that was the closest thing that I could come to.
Yeah, I think it's, anytime that you fixate on someone for your own sexual gratification.
Fixate is a good word, yeah.
Yeah, imagine things afterwards or just stare. But it's different from just, oh, wow, they're beautiful. And then going on with your day and thinking nothing else of it.
Yeah, right. Exactly, yeah.
Keith, we'd love to hear your thoughts on this.
Well, what I was going to say is that, you talked about how these messages hurt both men and women. And that is absolutely 100% true. But I think that as men, I think that one of the things that's really important for us to acknowledge is that we've been hurt in different ways. And quite frankly, women have been hurt worse than men. And so I think it's okay for us as men to unpack how we've been harmed by these messages. But I think when we're in public spaces, I think it's incumbent on us to say, as I'm talking about this, I realize my sisters have been hurt worse than me, and acknowledging that, because a lot of men just don't acknowledge that. Like you said, the example you gave was a man cheated on his wife. And the question was, what did you do to the woman?
Exactly.
Like, you know, were you having enough sex? Right? The example of lust, right? Lust is a sin. It's talked about in the Bible. How did Jesus handle lust? If your eye causes you to sin. And what do we say? Why were you wearing yoga pants in church? Like, women have been hurt by this way worse than men. And I think, yes, we should talk about that, and we should talk about this. You can be a healthy man and have a healthy, normal male sex drive and still not be a hideously awful sinner.
Right.
But I think that even as men, as we're working through that, we should be spending at least half of our time working through all the bad messages for women and trying to make the world better for them too. That's all I have to say.
Well, but even as you say that, I don't want to get off of that too quickly, because you spoke to what I'm going to call the selectivity of which scriptures we're cherry picking. Right. Yeah. So when we talk about lust, and when we say, well, you shouldn't have, to the woman, you shouldn't have been wearing that. But we forget, if your eye causes you to lust, then pluck it out. Well, that's an internal experience, right? But we don't do that. And even, in 1 Corinthians 7, which is the main culprit passage that pastors who have not been adequately trained on how to counsel people with sexual brokenness, that's the one they remember. It talks about how often you ought to be having sex. But even before verse 5, don't deprive each other, there has been so much already said to the husband about what is his responsibility to his wife. But I don't ever hear people coming out of those meetings telling us that that was the first thing that was asked. So often it's, well, how often are you two having sex?
He's looking at porn because, well, if you had more sex, and we literally hear these things from women.
And that's a strategy that's like giving a diabetic kid the keys to a candy store and just saying, give him everything that he wants and everything's going to be great.
Well, what bothers me too is porn and sex, that's treating them like they're synonyms, like they're substitutes for one another. And they're actually polar opposites, because porn says, I want to use you. And sex says, I want to know you. Porn is actually running away from authenticity and vulnerability. And sex is supposed to be running towards. And so you cannot use porn as a substitute for sex any more than you can use sex as a substitute for porn, not real sex. But I think there's something, even if we go a little bit backwards, before we tackle 1 Corinthians 7, let me ask you a question. What is sex? Because that's where we're getting messed up. Right. We don't even have the correct definition.
That's right. That's right. So many.
When you have intercourse, that's all. That's what I was taught.
But that's everybody was taught. It's when the penis goes in. And that's part of it. No argument. That's a part of it. But so many people that I've talked to about their relationships, and they're saying, well, we haven't had sex. What have you done? Well, I mean, we fondled each other. We gave each other oral sex. We, did it. Well, I'm like, well, I got news for you. You've had sex. You just haven't had you haven't had penetrative intercourse. And they look shocked because they've grown up their whole lives being told sex is when the penis goes in, because that goes all the way back to the birds and the bees talk, which if they got any at all, they probably just got one that took 5 minutes.
Yeah. Yeah. We have a great course for that, by the way.
It's,
a sex and puberty course. Yeah. So
that's awesome.
We'll make sure to put that in the show notes.
Yes.
Yeah.
I can share that link with people for parents to share with their kids. But I think the definition of sex is even greater than that, because if we assume that it's sex or even sexual activity, like bringing each other to orgasm or whatever, the problem with that definition is she could be lying there making a grocery list in her head, right? She could be in emotional turmoil, or she could even be in physical pain, and it would still count as having sex.
You're right.
And that's not the way the Bible talks about sex. In Genesis 4, Adam knew his wife Eve. Sex is a deep knowing, right? It's intimate. In Song of Solomon, we read that sex is pleasurable for both. Like, she says more words in that book than he does, and she's having a good time. Okay. And in 1 Corinthians 7, we see that sex is totally mutual. And so if we read 1 Corinthians 7 through the lens of sex is a sexual act that we enjoy, which is mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both, then the do not deprive verses take on a whole new meaning. Because 16% of women in our survey said their primary emotion after sex was feeling used. If they don't have sex, she's not being deprived. If sex makes her feel used, having sex is depriving her.
That's so true.
Okay?
Yeah.
Or if she's not experiencing any pleasure, then having sex isn't giving her anything either. You can't argue that those do not deprive verses even apply if she's already not getting anything out of sex. So we have to go back. And until sex is something mutual, intimate, and pleasurable for both, we can't even be talking about do not deprive.
I just find it so sad that in the Christian world, our discussion about sexuality is that it is an animal drive that needs to be placated. Men have it, women don't. So women need to give it to men. I know it sounds really stark, but that's the way that most of the Christian writing that I've seen has been written. That's the way it sounds. And I just think it's so sad that that's our view in the church, because I think that what about if a person who's not married? Like,
I was just thinking
our
about
sexuality
that.
is part of who we are. It's not, we should have a much more expansive and holistic view of sexuality than that. And the reductionist kind of view we have that's infiltrated even the church is one of the big reasons pornography is such a huge problem, specifically in the church, because we've lost track of it. We think you can prevent porn by having sex because we don't realize they're completely different things.
That's right.
Because we're being taught they're the same thing, and they're substitutes for each other.
Yeah.
And that should never have happened.
Well, I was wondering what if single men go to leaders and they're struggling, the leader can't say, well, what's your sex life like?
Right.
Like, what do they tell them?
Yeah. For a single man, there's not a wife to blame for it.
Yeah.
And so there's even there's
they really probably go, oh, well, I don't know. Maybe you should get married.
Well, yeah. And can I just say too, like for men under the age of 40 or 45, I guess, because we did the survey a couple of years ago, the vast majority of porn use predated the marriage. So they already got married using porn. For men older, it's not necessarily the case because people tended to use porn when they got high-speed internet. So it just depends how old were you when high-speed internet came in.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
But if guys that were already using porn before they got married, it really has nothing to do with a wife. And I wish pastors understood that better. I wish authors understood that better.
Yeah, I'm so glad you said that. And I've said that a lot just in the community in which we walk with people, because I'm in my mid 50s. And so I didn't have high-speed internet until several years after we got married. But what I did have is a compulsive relationship with masturbation that way predated marriage. And so using sexual release as a way of emotional regulation. And so I had a relationship with that for 10 years before Stacey and I got married. And so being able to explain to a husband who's struggling, like, well, why is it so hard to stop doing this? Well, because you are breaking up with a long-term relationship. And the same message to her is, well, if he loved me, he wouldn't. Well, he does love you, but he's had a relationship with pornography for much longer than he's even known you. And so it's the expectation, A, that this is about the lack of a good outlet for sex, and B, that once I have it, it's just going to evaporate. It's just a naive approach to it. And because most of us don't have people who are telling us the truth.
Well, I think what you said, Sheila, about sex and porn they're not the same. I mean, so many women, they love sex. And I think a lot of people who didn't like it, or it's painful, or, a lot of things like that, it's like, well, if I did like it and I did want it and I did initiate, which was my case, if I liked it and was better at it or whatever, then he wouldn't have to go do. But sex can't fix the porn issue. It's just, it doesn't work.
And I think too, a lot of people use sex like it is porn. And this is why they think they're substitutes, because their treatment of sex is like porn. And we see that a lot, when people have been using masturbation, pornography as self-soothing techniques, as emotional regulation techniques. What often happens is people are just very reticent, or they don't even know how to open up and share what's in their heart. They don't know how to get vulnerable with their spouse, because they often have a lot of shame that they're covering up. They don't even want to face what they're feeling or experiencing. And so if they can't face it in themselves, how in the world can they open up to a spouse? And I think I got this phrase from Michael John Cusick, but one thing he said is, like, sex allows you to feel like you're connected without having to do the work of connection. And when we're taught over and over again in Christian circles, you need to have sex, you need to have sex every 72 hours, or he isn't going to feel loved or whatever, then maybe you dutifully have sex and he feels connected in some way because this is what he's been taught connection is. But that's not real intimacy. because he's still not opening up on a heart level, and he still sees sex as something which is more of a self-regulation, self-soothing technique. And it just feels empty for everybody.
It's just now he's using your body instead of just his own body.
Exactly.
To get it done.
Yeah.
Okay. We're about a half an hour into this conversation. And I want to go back to the hope that, Keith, you talked about at the beginning, because I think at this point in a conversation like this, there's a whole lot of people listening. They're like, yep, that's been my experience. Yep, I'm in that same ditch. How do I get out of it? Right. So I want to pivot a little bit if you guys are open to that. And I'm interested in talking about what married couples can do once they realize that they don't want to subscribe to these old approaches, this old conventional wisdom. And before I get more specific, Keith or Sheila, I would love to hear from either one of you, this equitable way of relating to each other sexually, relationally, showing up authentically. I mean, is that how it's always been for you guys? Or did it start out one way and you've learned, like everybody else, how to do this?
I think I'll let you take this one.
Yeah. The book, The Good Guy's Guide to Great Sex, that we wrote together, it's kind of like my letter to younger me. Like I wish I'd known things earlier on, because, the things that I was taught, my own selfishness, my own woundedness, my own either inability or unwillingness to work through, core heart issues, to be vulnerable, that sort of stuff caused me to have a view of sex in the beginning of our marriage that made the problems we had even worse, and really hurt Sheila in a lot of ways at the beginning of our relationship, like quite significantly. And I've had to kind of work my way out of that as best I could since then. And Sheila's really gracious and wonderful to me. But it was the hopeful part of that is that, yeah, you can come back from bad decisions. So no, we haven't always been as healthy, and it's a lot of it's because of what we walked through.
Yeah, like I had vaginismus when we got married, which is a sexual pain disorder. We found an incidence rate of about 23% among evangelical women, which is around 2 to 2.5 times the rate of the general population. So this really is a largely evangelical or fundamentalist religious problem. And we were able to trace a lot of the reasons why, but much of it is this whole obligation idea. When we tell women you're obligated to give your husband sex when he wants it, then sex is no longer a deep knowing. Because what she wants doesn't matter. What she feels doesn't matter. She's obligated to give her body anyway. And our bodies literally experience that as trauma. And so I think I entered marriage with a lot of trauma from the books that I had read, which told me I didn't have any agency anymore and that I wasn't important. And so your body is trying to protect you from this thing which is unsafe for you.
Can I pause in there and just point something out that I think to the four of us may seem obvious, but maybe not so much to everybody else? You just described when your body is not prepared, not feeling safe, not willing to engage sexually, and yet you are forced or force yourself to do it. I mean, that sounds like assault or rape.
Yeah. And that's what your body feels like.
Right.
Even if that isn't the dynamic. And interestingly, what we found is that women can experience that even when they have the best husbands in the world.
Right.
It isn't always a dynamic within the marriage. It can be, and it is for many women. But it's also just this messages that we've internalized.
But that can, I would imagine, produce crazy making in the internal experience of a woman who's feeling like she's being assaulted, but is able to convince herself otherwise because he's kind and he's great and he loves me. Yeah. So, but that confusion can keep people from going deep enough to recognize and address what's going on. Yeah. And if we just try to put our head down and soldier through, how is it ever going to get different or better?
Right. And we're told that it's a sin not to soldier through, right? Because you're not allowed to take a break. Like even if your husband's using porn, you have to keep giving him sex every 72 hours or whatever it might be. That 72 hours thing is in a lot of books.
We remember.
What is that garbage?
Yeah, James Dobson started it in 1978. We managed to trace it back to him based on no research whatsoever. And then people just kept repeating it. So, yeah.
Well, do you remember like before all my stuff was out and we were in recovery, I was in an accountability group and we all went through every man's battle together. And, we were finding certain things helpful in addressing things we hadn't thought about before, for sure. But then like you read it, you locked in on that 72 hours.
That's all I remember from the book.
And so, I mean, I could set my watch every 3 days. You okay? We need to do something, and it was just like, it was checking something off, but it wasn't for intimacy for you. It was for safety.
Trauma. Yeah. It was traumatic.
So with you guys having learned from not always experiencing it this way, how can a wife and husband who previously signed on to the old way of thinking, about how Christian men and women relate sexually, when they decide that this isn't biblical and they want to move towards something different, what does this look like? What can it look like? What are some of the common struggles that they find when they're trying to move in a different direction? But then what are some of the joys that they can discover just with this new way of approaching each other?
Well, let me tell you a story that we told in the book about a woman named Kay. She had actually, they had started marriage pretty well. She'd really been enjoying sex, reaching orgasm frequently, et cetera. But then she had a bunch of kids, and with each kid, her postpartum depression got worse. And so by the third one, she just had a long time getting out of that PPD, but she still initiated every 72 hours once they were able to start sex again because she was supposed to. And this went on for like 2 years, did not have an orgasm, really started resenting sex. And her husband sat her down and said, like, I know you're not into this. Like, I don't understand what's going on. And she said, well, I know that we need to, and I know that you need it. And he's like, no. I do not need this. I don't ever want to have sex that you don't want to have. Like, if you're not into it, we need to stop, and don't ever initiate if you don't want it. So like, even if we're in the middle of it and you're like, yeah, it's just not doing it for me right now, I will gladly stop, and we don't have to do anything. And over the next few months, he proved that to her. So if she wasn't into it, that was okay. Or if they started kissing and she was like, no, he would just roll over and go to sleep, and it was fine. And because of that, her libido came back. And she started to reach orgasm. And it took a while, but she started to. And then they just got into a new routine of only initiating when somebody wanted to, and knowing that the other person could say no without repercussions. And now they have sex about every 72 hours.
And so
for totally different reasons.
It's different. Yeah. It's different. Yeah.
And who could have predicted the link without help? Who could have predicted the link between confidence and trust and libido, right? And neither one of them probably knew that what she needed was for him to demonstrate that he really meant what he said.
And I think that's the call to us as men who, typically men, whether it's our culture or whatever, have a more felt need for sex. But it reminds us as men that this is not, it's something that you can't live without. It's something that's supposed to be mutual. So if I am grumpy and annoying and stomping around the house if my wife's not having sex with me enough, the answer shouldn't be for my wife to have more sex with me. The answer should be for me to go, hey, what's going on in my heart that I'm doing this?
Yeah.
And that's the challenge for us as men to grow and to reach that, because sex is something that's incredibly intimate, not just physically, but emotionally, even spiritually. But a lot of guys they don't know how to connect that way. They just don't. And it's vulnerable. It's difficult. And I think that the whole experience is so much better though if we as men learn to be willing to look inside ourselves, see why it is that we're acting the way we're acting, see what it is that's causing us to behave that way. Not in a way of judgment, but in a way of like, how can I grow? How can I be better? How can I be more available, more transparent, more accountable, more intimate with the people around me?
And that list that you just gave us are things that you're going to experience when you're showing up as your adult grown-up self, right? Because when you're walking around the house grumpy, when you're not getting sex as much as you want, I mean, how's that different from a kid who's throwing a fit when you say no dessert before dinner? I mean, when we think about that, we really are showing up kind of in a child consciousness. But there's benefit from being able to stay in our adult selves. And the benefit is a lot more than just getting a sexual release.
Obviously, we walk with people that are in recovery. Maybe they're still married. Their wife wants to see if, they can restore the marriage. And he is 1 weekend sober, but he's withdrawing is what we would say. He's feeling that. And so I had a talk with somebody recently, and literally he was grumpy, and she's like, what's going on? And he's like, well, I'm a week sober, so I'm probably just feeling like, I'm withdrawing. And so I'm grumpy. And I mean, it was maddening to her, which I understand, but I'm like, addiction, your brain literally gets hijacked. So how do you talk to people about that's legitimate, but then the wife doesn't want to hear that because it sounds like if we had sex, I wouldn't be grumpy.
Yep. I think in those moments, and it's so important to start new habits of how to connect emotionally where maybe you haven't done that before. Because if he's been keeping the secret, if he's had this double life, he hasn't really opened up to her.
That's right.
And chances are he's been spending a lot of his mental energy trying to figure out when he can be alone. So he's seen her as a problem. So if she wants to talk, that's actually a threat to the time that I might be able to get alone. So we need to have a totally new way of relating. And there's a really simple exercise. It only necessarily needs to take 5 minutes a day. It could take longer, but it doesn't need to be really long. But at the end of the day, share with each other, the moment today where I was the most in the groove. Like, I am doing the thing that God put me on earth to do. This is like incredible. I am so into it. And then the moment where you were like the most defeated, and we're just like, oh, I hate this. I'm slogging through. This is so hard. And we started doing that because Keith was working an hour away. It was a great job. And it was much better for your mental health and your physical health because he wasn't sleeping. He was on call constantly at the hospital here. So he went to work for another hospital, but he was often had to be there overnight. And then at the same time, I was speaking on weekends, and we were like ships in the night. We were, not really seeing each other. So we started just doing that as a way to just fill each other in. Because what do you usually do? Well, what did you do today? Yeah. Well, I had 3 client meetings. I went to the bank at lunch, doesn't tell you anything. But connecting, sharing 2 emotional moments is so important because it lets your spouse in on your emotional life, but it also lets you in on it.
Yes.
Because quite often we don't even realize what we're experiencing. And so having to think about it and vocalize it. And I started noticing 5 days in a row, my moment when I felt the most defeated was having to face my inbox. And that's when I realized I'm going to hire someone to go through my inbox.
There you go.
Yeah.
Well, and I know when we got into recovery, almost immediately I experienced you because you had a sponsor and somebody that you knew and had a relationship with, getting in a group of men where everybody understood what everybody was going through. You had that connection and that relationship that was healthy. And I've experienced you not having those strong sexual urges, as people would say. Like it really, that, and it wasn't just for me.
I wasn't putting the full weight of my connection needs on having sex with you
and
anymore.
And I need my girl time. I need to have fun with my girls and get that skinny margarita that I get every Tuesday with my friends because it's half off, and so, yeah, there's so much more that actually you feel satisfied is what I'm hearing you say when you connect emotionally. I'm not saying that you don't need sex anymore, but like that would be helpful.
And when there is that tension, because we're still getting over this betrayal, we're still getting over, then, connecting just allows you a window.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it says, no, I still do want to open up to you. I'm making the effort.
That's right.
And I'm committed to this.
So you guys have been super generous with your time, and I know that we're getting close to needing to wrap up, but I want to ask one more question that could be opening a huge can of worms. So I don't know if we're going to have to edit this out or trim it down or whatever, but we've talked a lot, and we've heard you talk a lot about purity culture. And when we hear those 2 words spoken together, there's a lot of evangelicals that get that full body chill because especially people that are younger than us who really grew up as sexually developing into adulthood during that phase, I guess in the probably the 90s and early 2000s, where there was just this very clear message that now we can look back on and see that there was so much harm in that. So separating purity culture from purity as a concept. Right? As we unpack the harm that has been caused by purity culture in so many people's lives, how can Christians reclaim like a true biblical concept of purity. And I guess what is that true biblical concept of purity? Because if we believe the gospel, then God looks at us and he sees purity already. That's not tied to what we do or don't do. Whether we're experiencing what we've already been given is another thing. But so how have we let that word itself just be bastardized to mean something extra biblical? And can it be reclaimed in the lives of people who are hurt so badly?
Okay. I would say our purity isn't based on what we do with our bodies. It's based on what Jesus did with his. And what purity culture did was it said that a girl's worth in particular, because the messages were far more to girls than they were to guys, but a girl's worth in particular is based on her virginity, which is so problematic for all kinds of reasons. One of which is your virginity can be taken from you, which is horrifying. But it also came with a bunch of messaging. So purity culture was not about saving sex for marriage. Purity culture was about the way that I express the fact that I am a Christian is that I stay a virgin until I'm married. And that's a very different thing because it becomes your identity. And it was combined with messages about how boys can't help it. You know, they have a sex drive that you'll never understand. They're visual in a way you'll never understand. So you need to be responsible. You need to be the brakes in any relationship to make sure it doesn't go too far. Once you're married, you need to have lots of sex with him to make sure he doesn't lust. You need to make sure that you dress appropriately so he doesn't lust. And so women became sin management tools for men. So the responsibility to keep men from sinning was placed on girls and women. And we saw this even with preteen girls. You know, when my youngest was 11 and she was starting to develop, her Sunday school teacher took her aside and said, you can't wear V-necks anymore because the men in the church may look at your chest. And we couldn't get her to go to church for the next 3 weeks because she was so freaked out by the men in the church. But imagine telling an 11-year-old that she's now a danger to the adult men in the church. But that's what we did. And if we're going to undo that, then we need to realize that the Christian virtue isn't purity, it's chastity. And chastity just simply means that I am putting my sex life under the lordship of Christ, which means that when we're married, we can have a great time as long as we are still being respectful and kind to one another and not dehumanizing. Right. So we're loving each other in an intimate way. And when we're not married, we are choosing to treat each other with kindness and respect and honor the dignity in each other. And ourselves. And that's what it needs to come back to, as opposed to celebrating this ridiculous
fetishism of virginity.
Yes, that's the word.
Yeah. That's what purity culture was. It was a
fetishism of virginity.
Particularly female, like women's virginity, right? And this is one of the examples too. We talked about how both men and women are hurt by these messages, but women are hurt worse. Because, you know, men are basically told you have a sex drive you can't control. So women need to be the brakes in your relationships. So men don't learn self-discipline. Men don't learn to interrogate, you know, why it is that I want these things. They don't grow and develop as individuals, and they remain in a state of immaturity. And that is a terrible damage to men. But it's nothing like saying your value is gone now that you're no longer a virgin, which is what we said to women.
And you're talking a lot of times, people are talking about this flower analogy, and the girls have already had sex, and then you know what are you doing about that? Nothing. They just walk away in shame, and
so the harm to men sounds a lot like the soft bigotry of low expectations.
Yes,
that's exactly right.
And the harm for women is it could involve that, but so many more levels. I mean. Giving, you know, encouraging boys to abdicate responsibility for their holiness to the girls in their lives and just piling that on. I mean, it's really abusive.
Yeah, it's rape culture. It's rape myths too. So,
Wow.
So if people are realizing that, like, every time I hear the word purity, it makes me shudder. To hear, like you say, let's not synonymize purity and chastity. Let's see the distinctions between those two things. And purity is something that has been given to you. It has been done for you. It's not about what we do with our bodies, as you said. It's about what Jesus did with his. So is it really just about rehearsing and reiterating the messages that we've used these words wrong? And this is what it's like to use these words correctly. I mean, words matter.
Yeah, they do. And different words have hurt different people. So I feel a little bit uncomfortable saying this is a word that you should use instead, because everyone's past is different. Right. But I think that we do need to interrogate, what was I taught and how did that affect me? and talk to your spouse about it. Like when you first learned about sex, what were your emotions like? Can you think of a time when you were 11, 12, 13 where you were really embarrassed about something? Tell me that story. What did that feel like? Did anything ever scare you about sex when you were younger? Just start asking yourself these questions and talk to your spouse about it and shine a light onto some of the formative things in our lives, because it can answer a lot of questions about why you react certain ways to certain things. But we did, like when we did our surveys of the messages that women got as teenagers, the generational divide was huge. Like Gen X and boomer women were much healthier than millennial women. We did a real number on millennial women. And that doesn't mean that Gen X and boomers emerged unscathed, because many of us still had purity culture, but it was more fringe in those days, whereas among millennials, it was mainstream in the evangelical church. But there's a lot of pain there among, women in their late 20s and 30s. That, just needs to be confronted and understood.
Yeah. I think understanding has been a big part of what's helped us walk through the last 15 years, because I had so many reactions and feelings and they didn't make sense, because all the things that I was taught I thought were like legitimate, and not everything was wrong, but there's so much that I'm like, oh, that's not actually what the Bible says, and just, I think understanding so much, even some of my reactions early on in our marriage, that I felt like I was being forced, and he wasn't doing that at all. And I'm backstory of family of origin. There's sex abuse in my backstory. Never knew, never had conversations about that. And so understanding that, can't go back and change that. But like that has been a game changer for us. Like,
Absolutely.
Oh, well, this makes sense. And of course we can get your book. A lot of people can get your book and get a lot of help that way. Books. I'm thinking of the Great
courses,
Sex Rescue, which we specifically were like, yes.
Right. Well, Sheila, Keith, we can't thank you enough for spending this time with us. We know, and we'll put in the show notes, you guys do a lot of speaking together. You got multiple books. You've got a very robust presence on social media. You use your Instagram to fix a lot of things in people's books. Fix it for you. And so we're going to make sure that people know how to get in touch with you. But we are so appreciative. We'll give you the last word. If there's anything, just the last thoughts you want our listeners to hear as we wrap up our time.
Well, one of the things I always like to tell people in this space, working on a lot of sex recovery stuff, is that one of the things I've consistently found is it doesn't matter how big the problem, if both of you are completely willing to dive in and address everything and be really vulnerable, people can get over it. But at the same time, even if it's something pretty small, if the person who did it isn't willing to do that work, you may never get over it. And
That's
so
true.
Just dive in. It is so worth it. It is so worth it. So get vulnerable, even if it's hard. Do the hard stuff, because on the other side, there's so much freedom.
Man, that couldn't say it any better. We'll just leave it right there. Sheila Wray Gregoire and Keith Gregoire, thank you so much for being with us today. God bless y'all.
Thank y'all so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.